So, this is quite significant, wouldn't you say? For those who don't know, back in 2018, there was an expedition to Loch Ness to take samples of the water and do an eDNA test of the samples. eDNA means environmental DNA. It basically is a fairly new method of research in which you can take a sample of water or dirt or anything from the environment of an area, and you can find the DNA of what sort of creatures exist there. And that could be considered quite significant in the realm of cryptozoology, which is all about finding new species. Heck, it's significant to biology in general. But it is significant for cryptozoology because for all these years, we've been seeing photographs and video and eyewitness testimony and audio recordings on occasion of these unusual creatures people claim are out there, but the saying has always been, we need a body, we need DNA, we need something we can actually scrutinize beyond just an image or something. Well, the results are in for Loch Ness. Now, the reason we're only hearing the results now is because it takes a while to sequence DNA, and there was a lot of stuff to sift through in these waters, apparently. But the results apparently point towards the possibility that the Loch Ness Monster might be an eel. At least that's what the headlines are running with. The actual statements released by the research team are that there is a surprisingly high amount of eel DNA in the waters of Loch Ness, which came as a surprise even to the researchers. There is a significant amount of eel DNA in there. It's a lot of what they discovered, in addition to things such as fish and other creatures you might expect. They said there was no evidence that indicated anything like a plesiosaur, but a lot of eel DNA. And when you consider that in the right circumstances where it has little competition and would be the apex predator, an eel can grow to a significant size, at least potentially, then the possibility opens up that what people have been seeing all this time is a giant eel. However, a lot of the news outlets who have been reporting on this news seem to be jumping right to that conclusion in spite of what the research says rather than because of it. By that I mean, they found a lot of eel DNA in the water, but that doesn't tell us anything about how big those eels really are. And of course, the obvious question as far as the statement that there's no evidence of plesiosaur DNA would be, how would you know? They said they didn't find anything to indicate a reptile, but then again, plesiosaur DNA is something that we can't sequence because we don't have access to it, at least as far as I've seen. From what I've heard, last time I checked, the DNA of dinosaurs and prehistoric creatures like plesiosaurs is so ancient and so deteriorated that it's impossible to properly sequence. So that's why Jurassic Park is never going to happen, at least as far as our current abilities to realize it are taken into account. So, in that case, how would we actually determine there was no plesiosaur DNA? In fact, as a follow-up question, was there any DNA that could not be identified? Because sometimes when you're sequencing DNA and you have DNA that doesn't quite fit. Okay, let me back up a little. When sequencing DNA, the way it concludes what species matches the DNA is that it cycles through everything and it makes a match. And if there is no match, if it's something that doesn't match up to anything in the databanks, it can either just categorize it as unknown or it can discard it as junk DNA. That can happen. So I would like to know if there was any of that occurred in the study. I haven't seen any mention of it, so maybe there wasn't any. But if there was, I'd like to know. That's just curiosity on my part. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not questioning the results here. Even though eDNA is a fairly new science, I do believe that it is a viable form of research. And if the results say there are a lot of eels in Loch Ness, stands to reason there are a lot of eels in Loch Ness. What I'm saying is, I think there's still a bit more of the process to go. We need to go back to Loch Ness, get more samples, and make sure that these results are consistent. We need to go through the proper peer review process if that hasn't been done yet, which maybe it has. I don't know. I've seen no mention of it anywhere in these articles. That's how we'll determine if the results are genuine. They need to be consistently replicated. And if that does turn out to be the case, which it could very well be, then we need to focus our attention on determining what that means. Does it mean the Loch Ness Monster really is a gigantic kind of eel? Or is it possible that those eels are simply a food source for something else? Who knows? Again, I don't know if there was any sort of discarded or unidentified DNA, so we have to take every single bit of evidence we can into account. But let's suppose for a moment that this does turn out to be the final result. There are a lot of eels in Loch Ness, and those eels can grow to a tremendous size, far bigger than average, and that's what people have been seeing all this time. You know what that means? It means the Loch Ness Monster is real. Just because it's not a plesiosaur like so many people were holding out for, doesn't mean that there's nothing there. People have been seeing something, and photographing something, and videoing something. It's just that it wasn't a prehistoric entity, it was an eel. A very large eel, possibly a new kind of eel. We don't know. All we know for certain is that there are eels in these waters. So, that in itself would still be quite significant. There is something in Loch Ness. That would be the takeaway here. Okay, so the answer isn't quite as exciting as a plesiosaur, but it would still mean that people have actually been seeing something. But like I said, we've still got a little ways to go before we can definitively say that's the answer. And for those of us still holding out hope for the presence of prehistoric marine reptiles surviving into the modern day, well, the Earth is mostly covered in water, and Loch Ness is far from the only lake to have monster sightings attached to it. So, we'll see what happens next. Either way, this is quite significant. I don't believe we've arrived at the definitive answer yet, but it's still significant. And perhaps this is what we need to finally focus the investigation in a direction that makes sense. And if nothing else, I'm sure Steve Alton is feeling pretty good right about now. Anyway, just thought you guys might like to know. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.